Hi, welcome to Procom's second Facebook Live. Today our topic is we're going to talk about interviews. And this is something that people feel that they are good at, but it's also something that as a candidate, you don't do often enough to be great at it because let's face it, hopefully all of us are employed more often than we're unemployed. And so during those periods where you are looking for a job or looking to transition into a new job, you have to go back out into the market and do these interviews. But again, there's probably a break between the last time you did them and when you're out in the market today. So what we want to do is just give a little refresh on some obvious and maybe not so obvious interview tips that can help you be successful as you hit that career market again. So what I'd like to do is introduce my panel today. I'm Wendy Kenna. I'm the Director of Recruiting with Procom. I've been in the recruiting industry for almost 19 years and have set up countless interviews with myself as well as for candidates externally with our clients. And I've also brought with me 3 other recruiters who's also set up hundreds of interviews in their careers and can give you some of the tips and tricks that they share with their consultants, but also things that they know have gone wrong and probably cost people jobs because of these little things that they haven't quite gotten right. So off to the side, I have Krista Mancino with me. Krista has been working here at Procom for over 3 years now, sets up countless interviews. She's also working right now with one of our clients, so she also has a perspective of some of the feedback she's gotten directly from clients in terms of what some candidates have done great, also some of those things that candidates may not have done so great. Off to my other side here, I have Irene de Guzman. She's one of our recruiting team leads. She's been in the industry for over 10 years and again, probably set up thousands of interviews now at this point, both directly with herself where she's interviewed candidates, but also with our clients and can provide a lot of feedback with our retail client sector as well as in our banking sector and government sector. And then I have Charles Leixon, who's been with the company for over 6 years and again, countless experience setting up senior consultants on interviews with many, many clients. So to start off with, we thought we should cover not just when you go meet somebody face to face for an interview, because a lot of times that may not be the way that you first interview with a client. Sometimes you have phone interviews, and a lot of times now people are looking at video interviewing or Skype interviewing. So we want to touch on that at the end of the meeting today. So the thing I'm going to start off with now is I'm going to pass it over to some of the experts here and talk about from the beginning of the interview, what are those things that you should be doing. So the first thing is I'm going to start with Charles here. When either you get that call from the client saying they want to meet with you, or the call from the recruiter saying, I have an interview for you. What's that first thing that you should be doing?
Yeah, you should be aware that 90% of the time after a hiring manager has received your profile, they're going to go online and look up your LinkedIn profile. So if you don't have a LinkedIn profile, immediately when this is done, you should go and sign up and make sure you have one in there. A profile picture is definitely suggested, but not necessary. It's also good for when you do get to the face-to-face, you have an opportunity to use it as an icebreaker. Maybe you worked together somewhere previously or at least shared a company or a connection. There's also probably valuable information in there that's not in the job description about if they're a specific manager of a specific section or department that you weren't aware of going into the interview because the recruiter was unable to get that information. You might be able to dig a little bit deeper, and it's just good all around to know where the person interviewing you is coming from.
Absolutely, because I think one of the things that's important is if someone's come from a technical background and you're coming from a technical background, or they've come from a more functional background, you can talk about how you've gone through a similar career path. The other thing is on LinkedIn, you obviously can see if you have any mutual connections. So mutual connections can definitely, you can touch on some of your mutual connections to see what they know about the person you're interviewing with. Mm-hmm. And potentially if after the interview, if you feel it's successful, that maybe they could put in a good word for you. Or you can also name drop somebody in the interview to say, hey, I know that we're good. It looks like we're both connected with such and such a person. And sometimes that also creates
small talk and Yeah.
it creates a small talk, creates a connection. It also gives them sort of that informal reference that maybe you're not providing.
Yeah.
That's a work reference that they feel pretty comfortable that they trust that person's judgment. So sometimes it's a great informal reference that you're dropping that they're going to do a backdoor reference check on, that you have also somewhat talked to you about and that you know is going to give you a good reference.
Yep.
So, now you've done a little bit of research, you're ready to go on the interview, you know who you're interviewing with. As you're getting prepped for the interview, Kristen, why don't you talk about what you should be doing before you get in front of the client?
Well, definitely you want to make sure you've showered, that you're groomed, beard is trimmed, hair looks nice, and you want to always dress for success. I'm a big fan of the saying, dress for the job you want, not the job you have. In this case, you don't have a job, so it's always better to be overdressed than underdressed.
Oh, yes.
In this day and age, a lot of the clients are have scent-free environments due to allergies and stuff like that, so you want to keep that to a minimum.
Well, you definitely don't want to you never know where you're going to interview. So sometimes a small space, if you're wearing strong cologne or perfume or even just a scented lotion, if you're in a small space that doesn't have great circulation of the air, sometimes it becomes overpowering and you're not remembered for the job and the skills that you have. You're remembered for the scent that you've left behind. And I think we've all been in interviews where someone has walked out of the room and your eyes are watering and
Or an elevator.
Or an elevator, and that's not the impression you want to leave behind. So if you are going to wear perfume or a scent, make sure it's a light scent and that you're not doused in it. And again, that goes for lotions or creams or anything that may have a stronger scent that
Maybe
to have.
just overall appearance too. You don't want to
yes.
be like overly bold, wear that neon green tie that time. You might want to it will make you a little bit memorable, but at the same time, like, do you want to be that memorable? Maybe pull it back a little and
Yeah.
tighten it up.
definitely.
And,
Sometimes something that's memorable is maybe a little colored
Pin or a brooch.
pin or a brooch or a nice necklace, or if you're a guy in your suit pocket having
A square.
a square that's a different color that just brightens
Something to
out.
pop it, but the whole package should be kind of.
Yeah,
Really
your
professional.
Yeah.
your fluorescent pink shirt underneath your suit is maybe a little bit too much in that situation.
And just going back to the LinkedIn thing as well, if you do have an opportunity to research the company and some of the employees, you can get an idea of what the culture is there and how the other employees typically would dress.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we've done a little bit of research before the interview. We've gotten dressed for the interview. Now we're on our way there, Irene.
Yeah.
What's the most important part, I think, about being ready for an interview?
Yes, this is really the most critical part. You have to be on time for the interview. And I've seen really excellent candidates just get rejected, no matter how great of a fit they are, how fantastic they are. If they're late, then they get declined. So the best thing to do is to really prep for the interview, scope out the location, make sure if you're going to be driving to the location, make sure that you know where you're going to be parking, as well as how much of a distance it has to be to walk to the location. If it's a big complex, for example, yes, you found your parking, but you have to run, for example, like across a wide space, and then you're going to be frantic by the time you get to the interview. It's also, if you're taking transit, it's really very important that you know what the transit lines you're going to be taking, and just make sure you give yourself enough time. The key is really try and be at least 30 minutes early for the interview, so you give yourself time to relax and make sure you're calm. But announce yourself not earlier than 10 minutes, just so you don't rush the client and not make them feel guilty if they can't welcome you as soon as you get in. So that's really a good thing to remember.
Yeah, because clients have their day planned, and if they're expecting to meet you at 10 o'clock in the morning and you show up at 9:30, they're feeling like, okay, this person's sitting out in the lobby, I should go probably address them, they're going to be sitting there for 30 minutes, but they actually may not have the ability to do that, so it puts a little bit of stress in the back of their mind.
Pressure that they're being rushed, so they might rush you.
And so if you show up 10 to 15 minutes early at the reception desk, then they're like, the interviewer knows, okay, my interview's here, my 10 o'clock is going to happen, but it's also totally acceptable in their mind to let you wait for 10 or 15
Yeah.
minutes, and they're not going to be stressed out about that.
Now, occasionally things do happen. I've had it so that, a candidate, maybe their car broke down, unforeseen circumstances. I was actually late for my first Procom interview. But if that situation does happen, it's okay to call your recruiter or call the interviewer and just let them know what's happening.
Make sure you do.
Make sure that you do that rather than just showing up late. Because I think there is a certain amount of understanding.
Yeah,
that things like that.
Sometimes that'll give you a
can
little bit of
happen.
flex, when
Yeah.
unforeseen circumstances. The
Definitely.
other thing you should also remember is different places have different procedure to letting you in the building. Sometimes you need to bring ID. Sometimes you have to. It's not just reception that's going to get you from point A to point B. You have to go from reception to another floor's reception. Sometimes some places have clearance, so you need to get signed in and all that sort of stuff. So there are, depending on what level of role and what company you're going for, I'm sure ministries and government has different, policies than, let's say, Tim Hortons or something in the retail world. It's probably a little bit looser. So you definitely keep that in mind as well and be prepared. Bring all your documentation just in case.
And it also adds time.
Yeah.
So it also
That's it. You take
it also
that in mind.
if you're there 30 minutes early and you realize that you have to go through a few steps to get to where you need to go, you've left yourself time versus showing up 10 minutes before and realizing I have to go to the reception on the second floor and then make myself to a different elevator bank up to the 20th floor and then go through and call the person on their cell phone for them to let me in.
And then knock 3 times and say the
And
same
so
password.
it's important that you give yourself time to go through some of those checks. So now you're at the interview, you're at the destination. And I think we've all been in interviews where someone's brought in a drink or brought in some food. What do you guys feel about that?
Definitely, I always tell candidates as a tip, try not to have coffee before the interview just so they can be very calm once they start the interview. But more importantly is not to bring coffee or not to bring any drink with you once you go for the interview. The client is not a coffee shop, so they might offer you coffee, but and you may or may not accept that offer, but definitely don't bring anything with you. Please don't chew gum as well. This is one of the worst things that gives the worst impressions to the clients. You can chew gum ahead of time, but make sure that you're not chewing gum once you're in the interview.
So another thing that sometimes happens is that you come to an interview and maybe the interviewer brings somebody else into the interview. So how can you prepare for that? Because they may not have seen your resume, or they may have, again, there's a lot of times where someone's like, oh, you should really meet my colleague. How can you better prepare yourself for those situations as well?
It's best to have at least, I think, 5 copies of your resume. Sometimes it could be a panel. There could be a piece of information that you missed, and some sort of miscommunication, or a lot of the time, when you're dealing with VMS, they're not allowed to give you all the information on exactly who's going to be there. And things change on the fly. If they really like you, they might want to bring in a team lead or somebody technical to quiz you about a certain thing. So it's great to have more resumes than less. And then the other really important point is to make sure that you have the exact resume that your agency has submitted, because often there'll be a cover letter or some sort of representation that's on there that you won't have on yours. And sometimes, you're tailoring your resume so often these days that you may just get mixed up and bring your standard resume where you added something very specific. And just being on the same page with them and being able to talk to that experience is probably the most important thing, because then it doesn't look like you tailored your resume specifically for that role. That information was already kind of there.
And so now in the days of mobile, I think most people have most young professionals have a mobile device of some sort, whether it be a tablet, a phone.
If you don't have a LinkedIn profile
Yeah.
and you don't have a cell phone, please go out and get both of those
Yes,
right away.
if you're looking for work, definitely you have to have at least a cell phone.
So you're going into an interview. I think one of my first experiences was someone having a cell phone. This was back in the 90s when cell phones were a new thing. Someone came in with their phone cord and asked the interviewer if they could just borrow a few watts and plug their phone in during the interview, which obviously set the interview off on a different tone. because the client felt necessary to tell us that they did that. So obviously they didn't take that so well. Now, I don't think people are necessarily doing that, but how should you handle your cell phone or any type of mobile device?
Completely off, 100% off.
You're not
I mean,
catching
unless
Pokemon.
you're told to like bring in a laptop to do a presentation or something like that, that'd be the only kind of exception. But as far as like the cell phone goes as a communication device, it should be completely off. I think even if they ask you to show you something with whatever technology you've brought in, booting it up in front of them will show that you were prepared to be undisturbed and give them your 100% attention.
Especially when even if you turn your phone on silent or when it's vibrating, you can you have it in your purse, you have it in your pocket, it starts to vibrate, and then all of a sudden it's distracting. You're in the middle of the thought, and all of a sudden your phone's in your pocket and it's vibrating, and you're like, oh, and you lose your train of thought. So it also just keeps you on point through the process. So we want to make sure.
Mine definitely just beeped in my pocket, I'm not going to lie.
And the other thing is you also don't want to be carrying it in your hand as you're coming into the interview.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily the most professional of appearances when you walk in. So you just want to make sure that you put that into your pocket or put it in your purse and keep it out of sight as you're walking into the interview.
Yeah, it's not something you want to put on, like, if you have a nice duotang or folder or briefcase, even if you want to go that far, and you have your resumes and whatever presentation in there, that's fine. That's something you want to put on the desk. But other than that, you want to be kind of hands-free, totally engaged with the client.
Okay. And then obviously, part of getting ready for any job interview is you want to know what the job's about. So,
Right.
Krista, why don't you talk through, what's the best way to prepare for that?
Well, you always want to make sure that you're very familiar with the job description. You also want to make sure you're familiar with the client, and as Charles mentioned earlier, the interviewer, if that's possible. You can do certain things, such as check the news for any updates on that specific client. If you're interviewing with a specific group within that company, then you maybe want to do research on the group as well.
Or any products or services?
Products, services, the types of technologies they use, and have in their environment as well.
So we have a question actually from someone in Procom. In your opinion, what is an indication from a recruiter or hiring manager that the interview is not going very well?
That
If they're answering their cell
It's-
phone, if they're on their phone, for sure, that's a slap in the face that it's not going well.
I would say if it's shorter than what it was supposed to be. So, I mean, that depends. But if they had planned for an hour and your interview is like 25
If
minutes.
it's under 50% of the planned time. But I mean, again, things come up. These people are very busy. So I think it's body language is sometimes hard to read. If you go in there and it feels very casual, and then all of a sudden they get very rigid, maybe you feel like you didn't answer something that well, try and maybe circle back at the end of the interview and say, if I didn't feel that great about saying I couldn't do this. In fact, I was thinking about it and I couldn't do X technology, but I've done Y, so I can kind of parallel them. Like, it's never good to say flat out no about anything in an interview, I think, but it's hard to read. But body language is definitely a big tip off that if they're disengaged, they're not doing eye contact anymore, and that sort of thing. That's kind of a.
Well, I think also a lot of probing questions, that you've said something and then they're challenging you on the items that you said. More than just probing questions. Sometimes there's probing questions. Oh, can you tell me more about that?
And then there's probing
because
questions.
that's very okay, I'm interested in what you're saying and I want to know how I can parallel that into what I need you to do. And then there's challenging questions where
Right.
I don't believe what you're telling me you actually did. And when you start to get more into those challenging questions, it's because there's concerns over what you're saying, or the numbers don't match, or the project length doesn't, there's something about what you're saying that doesn't add up, and they know something that maybe you don't know that they know, and they're not feeling now comfortable with you as a candidate.
Yeah, a good indication would be when it's a free-flowing conversation. So
Yeah.
basically, it's a little more relaxed, and the client is really engaging with you and really trying to get what you think about the questions that they're providing to you. So that's a good indication that
Another good
your interview's
indication
going
I
well.
find is typically when they ask you at the end of the interview what your availability is like, how soon you can start. as well as if they let you know what the next steps in the process would be.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think everyone's heard heard the phrase, you have one chance to make a first impression. How does that apply to the actual interview?
Yeah, definitely, you really have to psych yourself up before you go to the interview and have a very positive view on before going to the interview. Make sure that you have a smile on your face, but you're also quite calm. The handshake is very important. Really make sure you have a firm handshake and make sure you make eye contact with the client, so no avoidance of looks. But try not to be too firm. I've had that happen to me before when somebody almost broke my hand, and that's the only thing I could
Don't be
remember
afraid to give
from.
your hand a little wipe before you walk in there too, just in case.
Oh yes,
You have those
definitely.
jitters.
Sweaty.
Yeah, and make sure that you're upright, you're not slouching, you're not gloomy, or you don't give across that slouchy vibe.
Yeah,
and it's
that it's,
definitely very important.
Yeah, that it's not that you're too laid back about
Yeah.
it. It kind of gives off the impression that you don't want it that bad.
Yeah.
So
One of the things I would say is also just to avoid putting things onto somebody's desk. So if they're they're on one side of the desk and you're on the other side, moving things aside to put down your portfolio, or tuck it beside you on the chair, put it down somewhere discreetly. But using someone else's personal space can sometimes be seen as a negative.
Just the resume being out, I think, is really the only acceptable thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
keep your portfolio on your lap with your resumes in it, versus putting that down on someone's desk and putting it out in front of them.
Yeah, you don't want to show that you're reading off it, right?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the next thing that I think is really important is knowing your resume and how do you guys think that people should prepare for that, and why is that important?
Really, it's very important that you are very, very familiar with your resume. The worst thing is somebody asks you about something that they saw in your resume and you say, I'm not sure where that is. So make sure you're very familiar with what's on your resume. You can really cite examples of where you've done this or have done that. If the client asks you, tell me about your role at so-and-so company, and you are able to provide really detailed answers to their questions, and that really gives a good impression.
And that circles back to knowing the resume that you're bringing in as well, because I mean there's really when you get those confrontational kind of questions, it's going to be typically about two things. It'll be a technology or a specific time you've implemented or used that technology, and they may be kind of hammering you about that. Maybe you added that to the specific resume, so knowing that it's there, in what capacity that you used it, and then also kind of methodologies and procedures, right? They want to know how the environment that you were working in ticked, and not just how your team operated, but how you operated within that team, both on the technical and kind of functional.
How your personal experience directly relates to the job that you're interviewing for.
Right.
You want to
and how it's comparable to the role.
And you
at
want to
hand.
have examples ready of how you can align your experience to what they're looking for.
Yeah. It's
Specific
really important.
examples are important.
Yeah, it's really important that you know the projects that you've worked on, and you can relate that to what the client is asking, and you can really cite examples of what your role was in those projects and the accomplishments that you've been able to do on those projects. That's really quite important.
And I think, obviously we want to have some examples prepared for a lot of different things, because you never know which behavioral question is going to come out in the interview. And so you can always, it's easy to Google top 100 behavioral questions and try and think very constructively about, okay, which examples could I pull out for strengths?
Yeah,
Which ones could I...
A good interview will be able to pick and pull without saying, what was your biggest strength? What was your biggest attribute in this thing? They'll have ways of asking you that without being as blunt, and they'll be able to pull it out. You need to have specific examples from, I would say at least the last 3 projects that you've done where you've excelled, where you've fallen short, where there's been, how you've problem solved or
There was a team conflict.
That's
There
right,
was a
yeah.
turnaround strategy that needed to happen. And it's okay to say, there was conflict on a project, and this is how we overcame it, or this is what we did to resolve it. because not every project runs with zero problems, because if they did,
For sure. Every project runs with a lot of problems.
I think that's probably more normal than not, is that there is a problem on a project that, we couldn't, had conflicting resourcing needs, so it was difficult to bring in resources and to schedule those resources. So how we accomplished this is, we did some change requests, or we compromised with another project team to be able to schedule time here, and we made it up on the back end by doing X. And
Yeah.
so there's different ways that you can talk about those projects, but to say like every one of my projects went 100% smooth, or as a developer, I'm bug free, I've never had a bug in any of my code.
Liar.
Talk about those things. As a QA, things go through QA that maybe shouldn't have gone through QA. So no matter what role you've had, there's business needs as a business analyst that you've missed, and then how did you overcome those items? So I think it's really important, no matter what role that you have in a project, to talk about those failures or misses or near misses, and how you were able to overcome those. I think that's really important.
Yeah, it is. It's important to point out, and I think it kind of goes into our next points, is that it's important to point out the negative, but don't fixate on it. You don't want to throw a previous employer or a coworker under the bus necessarily, because again, it's such a small world. You never know who knows who, and how they may be connected to your previous situation or current situation.
Yeah, it's important to be truthful, but at the same time, you have to put focus on the more positive aspects
Exactly.
of what happened, and so that needs to be.
Yeah, and how you contributed to that as well. Don't just say, my team did a fantastic job. We all pulled together. Be like, well, I recognized that there was a problem, and was able to escalate it, and we all together then came together and figured it out. But show your role in the problem solving, and it's okay. Again, show your role in the problem. Be like, there was a disconnect here, and we were able to overcome that together.
You don't want to make excuses or put the problem on someone else. It's okay to admit that you struggled or failed at something, because it shows integrity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And so as you get to the end of the interview, how do you close off the interview?
You really want to close it strong, definitely. You want to be able to ask questions that you had in your mind, and they have to be very constructive questions, very well thought of, so you need to be prepared as well. That's why you need to be familiar with what you're going into. And asking those questions gives the client the impression that you're really interested in the role, and you took time to really think about and analyze and consider everything about the position, which makes you ask those questions.
Okay. So now we're sort of talked about what's going to make you successful when you meet somebody face to face, but that doesn't actually always happen. As we've all been aware of, there's a lot of phone interviews happening, Skype interviews happening. So Charles, why don't you talk about the differences that happen within a Skype interview?
Sure. So, number one is be aware of your surroundings. I think a lot of the time when you're engaged with somebody face to face, it's a little bit easier to maybe keep your hands down or talk to them eye to eye. When you're setting up for a Skype interview specifically, test your connection. Make sure if you can, just Skype with yourself on your phone, or try and Skype with a friend. Make sure your environment, the best way I would describe it is, imagine it's an office. If you have a desk, a proper office chair, sit there. It'll help you sit up straight. It'll help you focus. Make sure your camera is in line with the person's face as best as possible.
And not going up.
Right, or not off to the side. You don't want to be staring and having a conversation like this, because it's not really engaging. You think I'm talking to my cat, maybe. Another thing, try and rid yourself of any sort of distractions. I know if you're doing a Skype at home, it can be tough. You may have a farm going on, or kids running around. You never know. Have a non-distracting background. Try and have something very plain, but at the same time look comfortable. Don't go in a totally white room and wear a perfectly white shirt. You want to be dressed like you're going to an interview. Just because you're at home doesn't mean it's a sweatpants day, even though we all love sweatpants days. No?
You could have the dress shirt on top and then
No,
sweatpants
I
on
don't
the
know.
bottom. As long as you don't stand
Yeah,
up.
if you stand up for some reason, then that blows the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Be clear. Talk very clearly and concisely. Again, I know it's hard to look at an inanimate object and imagine a person being there, but you really have to just even practice doing that. Practice talking to yourself, open up the webcam and give it a go. Record yourself, play it back, and see what you look like. It's a great tool to, if you can imagine, talking to somebody and practice mannerisms and things that you probably want to tackle.
So probably one of the things about a Skype that's very similar to your email address is to make sure that you have a professional Skype name.
Yeah.
And so something that's not professional, you probably don't want to be giving that out to employers.
Yeah,
And
Girls
also,
15.
and,
Yeah, Fuzzy Bunny
not too
45.
cute. Definitely
And-
not
and-
too cute.
and especially having a professional, if you do have a photo on your Skype, make sure it's, again, a professional photo. And if that's not the Skype account that you want to use when you're Skyping with your friends or your family, that's fine. You can set up a separate Skype account that you're only going to use for interviews,
Right.
and have it set up
But you
with
should with your email as
with-
well.
I was going to mention that, yeah.
with a professional photo, a professional name that
I think that
exudes
the
professionalism.
standard that people are starting to go for, it's either last name dot first name or first name dot last name. That seems to be trending. Like majority of the people we Skype with, you try and have that. Obviously, a lot of us have names that'll
Yes, and
overlap.
it's easily searchable too when they look for you and not have to group around with.
Yeah, that's right. When you use
Numbers
the dots and they
yeah,
search your actual
codes.
name, it'll be up near the top of the list, and then
Yeah.
usually they can cross-reference with location. So
Exactly.
try for that, and then if you have to add a number, don't worry about that too much. Don't try to stick to numbers and letters, and don't put too many characters in there, because that's when it gets a little tricky on the search strings.
Okay, and then obviously sometimes there's a phone interview that happens, and a lot of times that's the first step in a process. So
Yeah.
before people are ready to commit to an in-person interview, or sometimes it's you're meeting with you're speaking with an HR person prior to actually meeting the hiring manager. What's the difference there with a phone interview versus a Skype? Because at least Skype, there's some non-verbal cues you're able to see because you're able to see the person's face.
Right.
When you get on the phone, all it is a voice on the end of the phone. So you're not getting that non-verbal feedback that you would normally get in both an in-person and a Skype interview. So how can you prepare a little bit differently for that?
Well, definitely it's very challenging to go on a phone interview. So the most important thing is really try and make sure that you are in a nice quiet place and that you're not going to be interrupted. This is important for you to be able to hear the client well, so that you can respond as well, and you have the ability to consider your answers before you just mouth off anything.
So the corner of Yonge and Eglinton outside, standing
Yes,
outside,
definitely
trying to...
not traffic in traffic or a lunch place where it's very very even. From your desk, it's important to try and locate somewhere else so that you won't be interrupted, because somebody might come up and just interrupt you during those phone interviews. If you don't understand the question initially, make sure you ask again before you say or provide an answer that's quite unsure. That's why it's important for you to be able to hear the client well enough and make sure that the client hears your responses as well, so that you end up with a most effective phone interview.
Use a landline if you can. Yeah, if you have taking access to a landline over a stairwell is for a quiet place would definitely trump
Yeah.
any day, because we all know
And
how
if not,
cars
just
get dropped.
make sure your cell phone is charged. Also, similar to an in-person interview, you should have your resume in front of you
Oh,
as
yes.
well,
Yeah.
to reference and anything. Another benefit of a phone interview as opposed to a face-to-face is that you can have additional preparation in front of you if you need. If you
Yeah,
feel that
you
you
could
need
have that person's LinkedIn sitting right there. You could,
Yeah.
anything, any background you have, any notes that the recruiter's given you, you
Yeah.
can bring, everything you want. You can have that cup of coffee.
Questions
Don't
that
chew,
you
don't
like-
chew the gum, but
Yeah.
but keep the coffee.
questions that you'd like to ask. You can
Yeah.
have it written down so you don't forget.
It's important as well to really have a smile on your face, because that really reflects in your voice when you're talking. So if you're smiling, you're positive. It really shows on the voice as
sure.
well.
And one of the other things that also when you have you don't have the opportunity often when you're doing a Skype or an in-person interview, but if you stand up, Your
yes.
your voice projects better, and if you're looking in the mirror, as much as weird as it is to be talking and looking into the mirror, you also
You get a little more confident.
You feel more confident. You feel like you're talking to a person.
Yeah.
So it also can help you be more confident, speak more clearly. You can also see when you're going too fast or too slow. It gives you a little bit of some feedback, even though it's not necessarily from the client. You can judge yourself accordingly when you're doing that.
Imagine if I stood up
Definitely.
and talked all day.
Yeah.
How would you guys feel
some of
about
us
that?
don't need to stand up.
It's like preparing for a speech, right? So you
Yeah.
have to imagine yourself, you can see yourself and how you're projecting, definitely.
Yeah.
And I think probably one of the other things is because there's no nonverbal cues, it's really important to make sure you're not droning on. So you want to make sure that, after you've given your points, you stop and then ask for clarification before continuing on.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you guys have anything else to add today in terms of what you feel could make everybody more successful in their interviews?
Get a LinkedIn.
Yes.
It's super important. I mean,
Yes, clients really check that nowadays with all of the technology. Even before seeing you for an interview, they will check your LinkedIn account.
and I do too. It's the very first
Scope
thing,
you out.
regardless of where I had the idea of pursuing, calling you for a certain role. The very first thing I do is cross-reference with the LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And try and keep on top of that. It's the way it's going.
I would just stress again the research and the preparation, as well as the outfit, because if you feel good, that's going to project. If you feel that you look good, it helps you feel more confident in the interview.
I think it's really important to realize that it's not a yes or no thing when you go for an interview. It's not just the client's opportunity to say yes or no to you. It's also your opportunity to find out about the position.
Yeah.
That's why it's really important to have your questions prepared so that you also know if you would be a good fit for the client that you're interviewing with. So at the end of the day, when everybody
Yeah.
makes their selections, it's going to be a good fit for you as well as a good fit for the client.
And there are questions that you shouldn't ask as well.
Such as?
You probably at this point don't want to ask about compensation.
Yeah.
That would be one, Charles.
Yeah, that's definitely a tip-off. I mean, the compensation is definitely one.
Time off.
Yeah,
You know.
stuff. Yeah, time off. I mean, some of those specifics you should have hammered out with the recruiter before walking in. If it's a permanent job,
Yeah.
you should have an idea, or as best as they can get, an idea of what the benefits and full package should be. Those are kind of minute details you don't want to leave that taste in their mouth, that you're not nitpicky, but again, those are things
Right.
that shouldn't overall influence why you're there in the first place. Like, you
Exactly.
should have a good understanding of the whole package, enough to be walking in there.
An appropriate time to ask those questions if you haven't been able to obtain that information prior to your interview would be final stages
Right,
or
offer stages, yeah.
offer stage. That can definitely deter the interviewer
Yeah.
for sure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, guys, for being part of the panel. And
Thank
thank you
you.
to everyone who joined us today and asked questions online and who are viewing this after the fact. So once again, thank you for joining Procom's Facebook Live.
See you soon.
See you next time.